Okay, continuing this little series of videos on taking better pictures of people, perfect portraits, let's get right down into the actual nitty-gritty tangible stuff that will take your portraits from being perfectly okay to ones that people will really want to stop and look at. Now in this video and the next video I'm going to talk about those soft skills, those slightly intangible psychology things that are all about interacting with, collaborating with and working with your subject. I've broadly divided them into two categories. This video is more about things your subject can do, and the next video is more about things that you as a photographer can do. But there is some overlap. Above all, I'll keep coming back to this idea that it's a collaboration between photographer and subject, because that really is crucial. Now, what is inescapable is that your ability to communicate with, direct a good performance out of, and collaborate with your subject will be key to getting a really good portrait. And the great thing about these skills is that they are the same no matter what type of portrait you're trying to get. They are the same whether you're trying to get something very controlled, very elaborate and very structured, or whether you're trying to go for a much more naturalistic approach. They're the same if you're using loads of equipment or very little equipment. Okay? They're also the same if you're working with somebody who's not very experienced, or an established professional model, or even a celebrity. Okay? These psychological principles and the sort of things I'm going to talk to you about what your subject can do and what you can do, are really crucial, and they're also pretty universal. Now, in some instances, I can illustrate what I'm saying using this shoot that I've set up with Lisa, a professional model I've worked with a handful of times, but in some cases, I'm afraid there's no illustrations, you'll just have to take my word for it. Okay, the first soft, hard to define, intangible, psychological thing you need to do before you start taking a portrait is have an idea. Have an idea of what it is you really want to photograph. Now that might seem stupid. You've probably already picked your subject. You want to photograph this subject. I get that, but in order to go beyond just taking a very basic, straightforward image, you need to know what it is that you're really trying to say. Okay? You need to know what your idea actually is. What concept are you trying to get across to the viewer of the final image? If you don't really understand that, you might get there, you might get an amazing shot, but you're lengthening your odds of getting there. Whereas if you have a clear idea before you start of what it is you want to say in the image, you're increasing your chances quite significantly of achieving that. Not least, you know what you're trying to communicate to your subject very clearly. Yeah, I'll come back over and over again to this idea of collaboration and the idea of directing your subject and getting a performance out of them. The specifics of that performance are basically what your idea is. Now, if all this sounds very vague and abstract, I apologise. What I'm really talking about, and this goes way back to something that I was taught at college, some 20 plus years ago, is your idea is going to be along the lines of, I want to say X about Y. Okay, I want to say this about this person. That'll be your idea. So it might be that your uncle is an incredibly skilled craftsman, and that's what you want to say in the portrait. You want a portrait of him that says, this is my uncle, he's an incredibly skilled craftsman. And then your portrait is working towards getting that across in a visual form, in a two-dimensional image, photograph, portrait. Okay, so there could be all sorts of things you concentrate on that. You might be quite detailed of his hands as he works on something. You might show him deeply concentrating, deeply in a flow state as he works on creating some of his craft. But if you don't know that underlying concept, you're kind of fumbling around in the dark. And this concept, of course, can vary hugely. Your concept might be as simple as, I find person A attractive. Okay, and if that's what you're getting at, absolutely fine. There is no harm at all in taking portraits of people because you find them attractive, but that ought to come across in the final image. Okay, even if it is as simple as that. But keep coming back to that idea of, I want to say X about Y, and you won't go too far wrong. It's very easy with something like this to disappear down woolly definitions and sound vague and arty-farty. But if you can communicate to somebody fairly clearly in as few words as possible, this is what this shot is about, this is what I want to get across. I want to make you, the subject, look strong and powerful, vulnerable, sensitive, thoughtful, whatever it might be. You've gone a long way to achieving a good portrait because you'll both know what point you're starting from and where you're trying to get to. Now, having taught this sort of thing a few times, I'm well aware that some people listening to this are probably thinking, that sounds really restrictive. I just want to go out and play with my camera and hope I get some good results. Well, feel free. The thing is, if you start out with no clear definition, your odds of coming away with a good image and an image you're happy with are probably fairly slim. It's not restrictive at all to go in with some kind of structure and boundary and saying, I want to say X about Y. It actually frees you up. It gives you creative freedom to say, right, these are the parameters I'm working to, this is the game I'm playing with this person, this is what this collaboration is about. And then you explore those ideas, you explore those concepts together. And even concepts like making somebody look strong and imposing, making somebody look vulnerable, there's a huge amount of leeway within those. Okay, you're not restricting yourself at all, really. And to be honest, the minute you make a choice about subject, a choice about location, a choice about what equipment you're using, you've already narrowed down your choices anyway. Okay, so don't feel that this is restrictive. If anything, it gives you more clarity and helps you understand better what it is you're trying to get. So before we get on to things that your subject can be doing, let's talk about that choice of subject in the first place. Now, very often as a professional photographer, I don't get to choose my subjects. I'm commissioned by a magazine, by a commercial client, by a PR agency, whoever it might be, to go and photograph a specific person. Okay, so I don't have a choice in who that person is. With my personal work, it's different. I can, of course, elect to work with certain people as long as they will work with me, and I can choose people for specific reasons, for a certain shot that I'm looking for. A lesson that I learned a very long time ago, literally as I started taking portrait photography when I was 15, 16 years old, is that the most attractive people are not necessarily the best on camera. It's very easy to be sort of lulled into, oh yeah, look at so-and-so, they're gorgeous, male, female, whatever it might be, and be desperate to photograph them because, oh yes, I'm quite attracted to that person. There's no harm in that, but you may be surprised just how stiff and lacking in self-confidence and presence on camera some very, very objectively attractive people can be. And by comparison, some people who you might not cast a second glance at can be fantastic on camera because they're very comfortable in their own skin and they're perhaps natural performers as well. As I say, I actually noticed this and discovered it really, really early on in my career. I was quite lucky in this respect. I didn't fall down the trap of only wanting to photograph the most beautiful people going. I quickly spotted that actually the best people to photograph are people who are quite naturally confident, are able to perform well on camera, and that's definitely something you should try and identify yourselves. If you're looking for good subjects, look for people who are naturally confident, who you think would take direction well, and who can perform well, because that'll get you much further than somebody who's just superficially attractive. Now, if they're both, bingo, but don't be drawn into just the surface appeal of someone. Now, if you are just starting out in portrait photography and you yourself are lacking in confidence behind the camera, whether that's just the technical aspects of a camera or perhaps using lighting for the first time, one of the best things I can recommend is actually paying a professional model. Now, it may seem like quite a lot of money to pay between £30 and £40 an hour for somebody to sit in front of your camera when your mates or your family might do it for a beer or for a bottle of wine. But with somebody who's experienced in front of the camera, they'll be very tolerant of you learning the ropes. As you try and work out some of the technical things you're struggling with or your lighting, they will be very patient, they'll be very understanding. They may even be able to offer advice and help because they've seen it before. It can be a very, very worthwhile investment. There are sites like Purple Port and Model Mayhem where you can find models local to you, but I would advise, if you're going down that route, do actually work with experienced professionals. Again, don't fall into the trap of, oh, just because somebody's attractive, I'd like to photograph them. Find models who've clearly done it a lot and know what they're doing, because they will be very, very helpful to you if you're just starting out and if you're lacking in confidence. The only tiny drawback is occasionally experienced professionals, models, celebrities, etc. can be quite scripted in how they behave in front of the camera. They can give you a standard set of moves. This is me in front of camera, being a model, A, B, C, D. But if you're really just starting out and learning and getting the hang of things, this is no bad thing because it'll help you get started, find your feet. Then once you've got your basic skills established, you can start to exert a bit more control over things. So let's stop mucking about and let's get into the actual specifics of what your subject can do in front of the camera to get you a better portrait. Now, for most of this video and potentially the next one as well, I'm going to be talking about people who are not naturally confident in front of the camera, people who are not experienced models or celebrities, but people who you're interested in, who you want to photograph, but being in front of camera is not their normal day-to-day job. One of the things I was taught many, many years ago as an assistant is that the secret to being good in front of camera is holding two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. You need to be self-aware and self-conscious. You need to understand that standing a certain way, holding yourself a certain way will make you look a certain way. You need that certain element of self-consciousness. You need to be aware also of direction you're being given by the photographer. So you need to be self-aware. You also, particularly if you're nervous in front of a camera, need to be self-unconscious. You need to let yourself go a little bit. You need to not think about the fact that there are lights on you and a camera pointing at you and potentially a lot of people in the room as well, and possibly even you're not wearing many clothes, or you're wearing a silly costume, or you're doing something stupid. Those two things contradict. Like I say, part of you needs to be very self-aware and self-conscious that standing a certain way, doing a certain thing will create a certain effect. But at the same time, not getting caught up in, oh my God, everybody's looking at me, I feel stupid. Explain this to your subject. Get this across to them, make them understand that what they're doing is inherently contradictory, and you'll help them out a great deal. That they won't get caught then in the idea of, oh, but it's really, really stupid, or get too full of themselves. They'll understand that they are walking a tightrope almost between self-awareness and being self-unconscious, if you like. The best way to get your subject to think about this is to get them to go with the flow, but have one eye on how they look. Another really basic thing to get right is always be aware of your subject's comfort, particularly if they're holding an uncomfortable pose or doing something tiring or difficult. If they tense up, get exhausted, get pissed off, that's not going to help your final picture, not to mention the fact that it's no fun for them. So selfishly, you want to make sure they are comfortable. Make sure they're not too hot, make sure they're not too cold, make sure they're safe above all. Even something like a studio where you've got full control over things can still be a potentially dangerous environment. There's lots of things like lighting stands and heavy equipment around that can harm people, not to mention electricity everywhere. Make sure all of that is taken care of and that your subject is safe and comfortable at all times. If you have to take a break in shooting at any point, now ideally you'll be going with the flow, you'll just be shooting continuously, there'll be no main big breaks or anything, but the odds are things won't work out like that. You will have to pause now and again to adjust lighting or change batteries. Make sure your subject understands that. Communicate this to them, make sure they're not left hanging around unnecessarily. Again, make sure they don't get too hot, too cold, whatever it might be. Make sure they're comfortable at all times, because you will get better results as a consequence of that. Think ahead before you shoot. If you're traveling to a location where the subject is liable to get cold, make sure either they've brought warm clothing or you've brought some, or you've got a thermos with hot drinks in it. If it's the opposite, if they're going to get too hot, find a way of cooling them down. Even if you're somewhere indoors and controlled like a studio, make sure they're well plied with tea and coffee. Make sure they've got a private place to change, and if needs be, somewhere to do their hair and makeup. All of these things will contribute to your subject being happy and comfortable, and that's almost always going to be a good thing. Now, this last little tip isn't strictly speaking about the subject, but it certainly isn't about the photographer. If the opportunity presents itself, a second pair of hands can be extremely useful. Now, as I said earlier in a previous video, I worked as a photographer's assistant back in the early days of my career, and a photographer's assistant's job can best be described as doing anything and everything possible to allow the photographer to concentrate on taking the picture. Now, when you think about it, that can encompass everything from very mundane stuff like fetching and carrying equipment, making tea and coffee, all the way through to really quite technical things like setting up lighting and getting exposures perfect. Having somebody around who can do that sort of thing can be fantastic, because it can allow you, as a photographer, to concentrate on getting the picture and getting that performance out of your subject. Now, at a basic level, just having a friend come along who can help you shift and carry things, make tea and coffee, that can be great. But if you've got somebody who really knows what they're doing, that can be a huge benefit, because it can take some of the thinking and some of the hard mental work off you. You can concentrate on that collaboration with your subject rather than worrying if that light is firing or that tripod set up right, whatever it might be. You get to concentrate on what your job is supposed to be about. Another reason to have a second pair of hands around, and this is particularly important if time is critical, is for use as a stand-in. I have got dozens and dozens of Polaroids of me as an assistant standing in for the person we were going to be photographing for real. Now, the logic behind this is very, very simple. If you've got a limited amount of time with someone, you don't use that valuable time in setting up the lights, getting the exposure right, working through which different shots you're going to get. You do that with your stand-in. In my case, me as an assistant working for these photographers, I would stand in and we would get the light set up and everything perfect so that when the celebrity arrived, the main subject of the photograph, they walk in, everything is ready to go, and we don't have to muck about very much. Again, it's all about focusing on that collaboration between the photographer and the subject and letting that take over and nothing else distract from it. So if you've got a second pair of hands, it's really handy using them whilst your subject is perhaps getting ready. If they're doing hair and makeup, that's perfect time. Get your stand-in in and use them to get the lighting right so that you're much closer to a point where you can just start collaborating, start working with your subject, rather than stopping, breaking the flow, fiddling with this light, fiddling with that light, changing your angles, whatever it might be. It's a really, really useful thing to do that can improve your shots. So those are things that you can do before a shoot and things that your subject can be doing to help you get a better portrait. In the next video, we're going to talk about things that you, the photographer, can be doing that will help you improve your portrait photography. In the meantime, this is YouTube, you know what to do, subscribe, like, etc, etc, etc. Stick any comments you have below and I'll do my very best to answer them. And I'll see you very soon.